Hello and welcome to part 45 of my VC Blender 2.7. In this video we're going to be talking about the camera effect called depth of field. So what exactly is depth of field? Well, I'm going to quickly flip over to a picture that I took a couple of years ago in my backyard of a bee landing on a flower. One of the cool effects that you get when you take macro photography, in other words photographs of things close up, is an effect where everything that is behind what you're focusing on and everything that's in front of what you're focusing on becomes out of focus. It becomes blurry. Now, you might think of blurry as being something that's not what you want in a photograph, but actually it's a tool that photographers and cinematographers use to get the exact image they want by focusing in and only having what you want in focus in the frame. I'm going to be showing you how to do that today in Blender Cycle. So let's go ahead and flip over to Blender. Alright, switching over into Blender now, let's go ahead and click on the splash screen to get rid of it. I want to point out though that I'm using a new version of Blender, version 2.74. It's actually the second release candidate. The full version, or the real version of 2.74, should be coming out in a few days or by next week, but I want to use it in this video because it's a new feature that incorporates depth of field into the viewport of your scene that's only available in this new version. Let's go ahead and click on the splash screen though. The first thing I want to do here is change my units. By default, Blender uses Blender units, which really don't mean a whole lot. So the first thing I'll do is go to my scene tab and change my units to metric. Now if you're more used to using the imperial system with yards and feet and inches, you can go ahead and do that. The important thing here is though that we're making a small scene. When you have a small scene, in other words, in the real life, when you're taking pictures of things that are near to your camera lens, when you're taking macro photography, let's say of a flower. When you take a picture of a flower, you're more likely to get that depth of field effect, where things in the background and foreground are more out of focus than, say, if you were to take a picture of a city from a mountaintop or a building that's wide, where everything in the photo is far away from the camera lens. So the first thing I do here is delete my default cube by pressing X, of course, and I'll press Shift A on my keyboard and add a new plane. By default, this plane is 2 meters by 2 meters, which is still quite large. So down here in my tool shelf, I'll change its radius for some reason, I'm not sure why they use that word, from 1 meter to 0.5 meters, so that the tile is basically 1 meter by 1 meter. I'm going to zoom in on that and press Tab to go into edit mode. I want to make sort of a backdrop here, so I'm going to select the back edge of this plane and press E and then Z and then 1 and enter to make another 1 meter by 1 meter plane for the backdrop. I want to make it smoothed out, so I'll press Tab to go back into object mode, and under the wrench tab I'll add a subdivision surface modifier to smooth it out. I want to keep it having kind of sharp edges though, so I'll press Tab to go back into edit mode, and I'll do some loop cuts here. So I'll press Ctrl R and then click and right click, and I'm going to bevel that, so Ctrl B. I'll pull that out to right about the edge to keep that hard edge there. I'll do some cutting on the top and bottom as well, so Ctrl R, click, click, and then Ctrl R again, click, and click. I'm going to turn my subdivisions up to 2 for view, and I'll press Tab to go back into object mode, and I'll set the shading of this object to smooth it out. So I have a little backdrop here where the base is basically 1 meter by 1 meter. In fact, what I'll do here is I'm going to pull that bottom edge out, so I'll hold Alt and right click to get the entire edge there. I'm going to pull this out so we have sort of a longer floor on that base. I'm going to go ahead and press 7 and 5 to go to my top view. I'm going to add a few objects here in object mode. I'm going to add some monkeys. The monkey head is huge. I'll turn its radius down to let's say 0.01, which means 10 centimeters or 10%. Actually, that's 1 centimeter. I want 10 centimeters, so right about there. And now it's about that big. In fact, I'm going to make it about 2 centimeters across. I'll make it quite small. I'll move it up so it's kind of on the ground. And I'm going to rotate it so it's sitting on the ground, and I'll move it up, of course. I'm going to add the subsurf modifier again to that one to make it smooth. And I'll click on smooth shading. So now I have a very small monkey head sitting on a fairly small background. So this should work for macro photography. I want a few objects though, so I'll duplicate this monkey head, Shift D, put one sort of back there, Shift D again, put one sort of up there. And now I want to focus my camera on these objects. So I'll press 0 on my numpad, or go down to the view menu and select cameras, and active camera. Our camera is way out here now. So I want to zoom in on these objects. What I need to do here is press this little plus or press N on my keyboard, and under the view section, I think, there's this lock camera to view checkbox. And what that does is lets me actually zoom or move the camera, even orbit the camera, by looking through it and orbiting. If I check that box, I can now do that, whereas if that checkbox is not checked, it just breaks me out of the camera view if I try to orbit or zoom. So that's a very, very handy tool under the view section with the N key for the properties panel. I'm going to zoom in on that monkey head. With it selected, I can orbit around it quite easily. I'll zoom in, and maybe I'll zoom out a little bit and try to center it. Looks pretty good to me. Maybe I'll select the backdrop and press X, and then X on my keyboard, S and X, to scale it to make it a little bit wider. And maybe I will zoom in a little bit more. Okay, let's go ahead and fix the lighting of this scene. If I press F12 or go to my camera tab and press render, the lighting isn't very good. Of course, I'm using my Cycles render engine up here, but I'll press 7 to go to my top view. I'm going to select that light. I'm going to change it under the lamp tab to an area lamp. I'm going to make it a square area lamp, and I want its size to be, let's say, 1.5 meters. And with it selected, it's kind of at an angle right now. Actually, that's okay. I'll just move it down to make it closer. In fact, no, I'll press Alt-R to clear its rotation out. And then I'll go to my front view and angle it the way I want. And I'll put it right over the scene. And let's do a quick test render, F12. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. It's not very well centered, but there we go. I will maybe try to pan that over. Maybe I'll zoom on that, and then I can pan more easily. By the way, if you ever get stuck and it won't let you zoom very well, it kind of gets slow, or you can't pan very well, what I just did there is I actually pressed the period key on my numpad, which is also, if you go to the view, and you have an object selected, and you go to View, and View Selected, that's the keyboard shortcut, numpad period, it'll zoom in on that object, which will also fix the scrolling and panning. I couldn't quite pan very easily there, that's why I had to zoom in. Alright, so we've got our scene, and it's lit, and we have a backdrop. Great, let's go ahead and press F12, or in my case, function F12, because I'm on a Mac with a full-size keyboard. We have our scene. But there's no depth of field. Everything is in focus. Everything's quite grainy right now. So what I might actually do is go to my camera tab. What that is your samples. That's how Cycles figures out or calculates light. Right now our samples are very low. They're at 10 render samples. So I'll change that maybe to, let's say, 40. And if I render again, function F12 or just F12 or just go and press render, we get less graininess. Of course, 40 is still quite low. But let's go ahead and move on. To get that depth of field effect, where things in the foreground, in other words this monkey, and things in the background, in other words this monkey, are out of focus, is we have to define what the camera is focusing on. Now we could just say focus on this monkey, but to get more control, let's actually go back to our top view, and I'll press Shift A, and I'm going to add a new kind of object. It's called an empty. And an empty is basically just a tool. It's an object that does not render in your scene, but it acts as a tool for other objects to use. That's the easiest way to describe it. I'm going to add a plain axis empty, and what that is basically a 3D cross. If I press Z on my keyboard, you can see what that looks like, but it's really big, so I'll press S to scale it down, and it's sort of in the middle of my scene. I'll put it from my top view, I'll put it over the monkey head, and then just line up kind of with the monkey head in the middle. And so what I want to do is have my camera actually focused on this empty. The benefit of using an empty and not just on an object is that you can actually animate this object and your camera will shift its focus. So if you've ever seen one of those movies where, you know, the camera is focused on something in the foreground and then it quickly focuses on something in the background, that could be done here by just animating this object and then rendering out that animation. What I need to do here is select my camera, right like that, and I'll go to my camera tab, and down here under the depth of field section, this is where we can enable that depth of field effect, the blurriness. I need to focus on an object, so I'll click on this little area here and select the empty object. Of course, I could select the empty object and name it under the object tab. I'll name it target. There we go, and that should be updated already for us under the camera tab. yeah, it's now focusing on an object called target. So now, if I press 0 to go to my camera view, and then change my viewport shading to rendered, what do we see? Still nothing. Why aren't we? Well, the way depth of field actually works in the real world, I'm going to flip back over to my photographs again, and the second picture I have here is actually a picture of a camera lens. What you're seeing here is the camera lens without any glass on it, and we're seeing this thing called the aperture. And what the aperture does is it actually has a few effects on your photographs. When this hole in these aperture blades is small, of course that lets less light onto your camera sensor or onto your film, but it also means that you're getting less of that depth of field effect. When you have these blades more open with the circle larger, that means the more light is getting into your scene on a real piece of film or in a real digital camera, but it also means you get more depth of field effect when this opening is larger. When you have a wide open aperture, you measure that with what's called an f-stop. So when this hole is a lot bigger, you might have an f-stop of 1.8. That's a really large open aperture, which means you're going to get lots of light in, and you get that nice depth of field effect. The smaller this hole gets in the aperture opening, the less depth of field you get and the less light you get in your scene. Now, light isn't a factor here. We're not going to be changing the amount of light with our Blender depth of field setting. But if I flip back over to Blender now, and with my camera selected under the camera tab, I want to change this aperture type for now over to f-stop. And it's here where I can actually change that f-stop number. Now remember what I just said, 1.8 is really wide open. It's a common number for a decent lens, that's a quick lens. So I'm going to go ahead and type in 1.8 there. As soon as I do that, you'll notice that in my viewport, because I'm using the rendered viewport shading, I get my background monkey and my foreground monkey out of focus with the monkey in the center where my target empty is. That one's in focus. I'll do a quick render, and as you can see, we get that nice depth of field effect. So what if I want more depth of field, in other words, more blurry or less blurriness, less of a depth of field effect? Well, I can change this number right here under f-stop. If I want more blurriness, I can change this even lower, although normally cameras don't go below less than, let's say, 1.4 or so, I think it is, and that's about as much as we would get if I render that again. We just got a little bit more blurriness in the foreground and background monkey. Other common values for f-stops, I'll go ahead and press escape, are 2.8, which is still quite wide open. You'll see sort of what I get here. This preview is only going up to 10 samples, so it's still quite blurry. When you make a final render, especially if you have depth of field enabled, you're going to want to have lots of samples, at least 100 or so. I would recommend several hundred samples to get it really nice, because when you use that depth of field effect, the samples get really bad when you have edges of blurred objects. If I change this up to 3.5, that's another common aperture. Again, a larger number means a smaller opening. It's sort of backwards, and then it becomes more in focus in the front, foreground, and background. 3.5 is a common number. 4.5 is a common number. 5.6 is a common number. And 8 is a common number, and so on and so forth, although you can use any numbers you want. So as you can see at f8, our foreground and background monkeys are more in focus. Now, what happens if you have a large scene? Well, if you have a large scene, in other words, right now our monkey heads are really small, and our whole background basically is 1 meter by 1 meter, except for when I extended it. The reason why I did that is that we would get this effect. If you have a large scene, just default cubes, and you wanted the same effect, you wouldn't get it by using f-stops, because this tries to act like a real camera, and you'd only get this effect on a real camera with a small scene. So how do I get that effect with a large scene? Well, I'm going to flip back over to my photos again, and the next picture I have, I believe, is an example of tilt-shift photography. This is where photographers use a special kind of camera lens that will emulate that small depth of field effect where you're using a very small scene, but on a large scale. Now this photograph is actually done in post. It's done in Photoshop. How do I know that? Well, what they did here is they basically blurred, using a Gaussian or focus blur, the whole top of the scene and the whole bottom of the scene. And I can tell that because this pillar here, or these pillars, are out of focus, even though they're at the same distance from the camera as that section. But what this does is it makes our eye think, hey, this is a really small scene, it must be a miniature model. even though it's not. It's sort of a cool effect, and you can do it with video as well. Of course, you can do it with animation. How you can achieve that effect in Blender is, instead of using this f-stop value for aperture, you can use just the radius value, which it is by default. By default, it's set to 0, and what this does is, let's say I change this up to 1 meter. You can see that it gets very blurry, again, because we have our viewport shading set to rendered. What this is essentially doing is it's scaling up our camera to be really, really huge. Basically, now my camera's aperture has a radius of 1 meter, which basically means 2 meters across. It's a really huge camera to simulate a very, very large scene. Basically, you're making a very large scene seem small by making a really, really huge camera. How do I get that nice looking scene again, like I had with the f-stop values, is I would change this back down to a very small number. If I use, let's say, 0.01, that's 1 centimeter, and as you can see, I'm getting a nicer looking scene here with my small scene, getting that depth of field effect nicely. I can change that down to, let's say, 0.005, and that'll be 5 millimeters. That gets me more in focus. If I go to 0.5 meters, again, it gets very out of focus, although that might be the number that you want to use if, again, you were using default cubes that are 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters in size. The last thing I want to say here is that if you have lights in the background of your scene, you might see in movies a lot where maybe it's a city scene in New York and it's night out, and the lights in the background are these kind of just blurry shapes. How you can achieve that effect, and I've got an example of it right here, where we have a silhouette. I think this is actually done in 3D. I found this on pixabay.com. It's a Creative Commons or licensed or royalty-free image. You can see that the lights in the background are not circular. By default, you get circular lights in the background. But if you want hexagons or pentagons, you can do that by changing the number of blades in the lens. The number of blades will determine the shape of the opening in the aperture, which in turn will determine the shape of the out of focus or bokeh lights in the background or foreground of your scene. To change the number of blades on your lens, that's actually right down here in the depth of field section of your camera. The blades are right here. If you use a number less than 3, it'll just make circular shapes out of background or foreground lights. But if I turn that up to at least 3, of course you can't see it in my example, but with 3, you will have those lights be rounded triangles. Of course, you can turn that up to 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, and you've got the corresponding shape. I'm going to go ahead now and make a new scene, because the last thing I want to talk about here is Blender 2.74's new feature where you can get the depth of field inside of your actual viewport, even when you're not using the rendered viewport shading. I'm going to go ahead and scale that default cube down. By default, it's 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters, but I'll go S and then 0.1 to make it very small. I'll press 0 to go to my camera, and I'll bring up my side panel with the N key and go to View and lock camera to View. I'm going to zoom in on that cube, and I'm going to duplicate it, Shift D and Y, just to make some in the background, Shift D and Y. I could use the array modifier, but I'm just doing this quickly. I'm going to focus in on that cube. So again, under the camera tab, I've got to select my camera. I can focus on an object. I'm just going to focus on cube. How I can see the depth of field effect in this window is, well, so what I have to do is go to my shading section, and you'll see a new option here in this new version of Blender called depth of field. This will be grayed out if you're not looking through your camera. You can see it's grayed out right now, but through your camera you can select it, and then under your camera tab we've got this new option here. It's under the depth of field section. It's called Viewport f-stop, and by default it's set to 128, and of course that's a very, very small opening in your aperture in which you'd get basically no depth of field. So I'll turn that down to 1.8, and as you can see, it's sort of kept this one in focus, but it gets more blurry in the background. You can see that this is not giving us a very realistic result. In fact, I would say that this option is basically in its first stages, almost beta stages. You can't unfortunately change this to radius, so if you want to use radius, this is not going to be a very good tool for you. But if you're using the f-stop number here, and let's say I had 1.8, I would hope that these two values would be approximately the same. I have found this option to be a little bit buggy. If you've already gone ahead and you've set up your scene and you've set up your f-stop number, and then later in time you check this depth of field option, I find that it doesn't really work too well. So that's why I made a new scene using file new and set up new cubes instead of monkey heads. I had tried this in a previous attempt of this video and it didn't work, so I made this new version. So if I press function F12 or just F12 or go to my camera tab and press render, hopefully we get something that looks approximately like this, although with lighting. Well, it did an okay job. It was less blurry than it was in the viewport, so it's sort of just a tool you can use to kind of get the right effect if that really matters for your scene. But that'll be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.